Damage dice are fun, alright? I'm not here to deny this fact, but there's a lot of reasons why they are not very healthy for a game, and let's go ahead and talk about it. Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Now today we're going to be doing another dive into a DC20 aspect, and this one's going to be health points and kind of how damage works in the system. Because some of you astute viewers may have noticed when I've talked about spells and things like that, that a lot of them might only do 1, maybe 2 damage, and that might feel weird. And you might be like, oh, well, what's your damage die? Well, that's the thing, there isn't one, and there's really good reason for it. So let's go ahead and break it down as to why I truly believe that this no damage die system is better and honestly will be more enjoyable for most players. So first we're going to talk about health points and kind of the formula for that, which is very simple. It is just 6 plus your character level plus your might. Very simple, very easy. There are many other way to actually get your health points to go up, whether that's your ancestries, which is kind of like your race in this game, or your class. Some of those also give additional health points, or even some magical items, which was just introduced as their magic item system. All these things can give you more health points, so don't worry, you're not like capped at this number, but that's the base idea. So if you want kind of a general idea, your average level 1 character is gonna have about 7 health. Probably the average is a little higher than that. To be clear, if your might is negative, it will bring your max health total down, which is scary, but you know, usually your worst case is a -1, in which case you'd have -1 health. So not the end of the world, but something to keep in mind. Now, along with this health comes something called health thresholds, which I'm going to talk about, and it also is going to tie into death's door. These are 2 topics that are not super crucial to the main point and crux of this video, but it's just important to note since we're talking about health. As for health thresholds, you are considered bloodied, which is kind of like a condition. It doesn't do anything on its own. Once you are at half health, you're considered well bloodied. Once you are at 1/4 of your health, this also goes for enemies, by the way. And then once you drop to 0 or lower, you are now on death's door, which we'll talk about here in a second. The bloodied and well-bloodied, the reason those exist is there are certain weapon and weapon properties that are going to do things with those. So for example, if you are bloodied, there are certain weapons that will deal an additional damage, or if you're well-bloodied, there are certain weapons that will deal additional damage, maybe have additional properties like applying a bleeding or whatever, is something along those lines. So they're not super important necessarily right when you become bloodied, but it is important to note that you are then bloodied, and other things might hurt you even more because you're in an inherent weakened state. Now let's talk about death's door, which is a very scary, but I think very good mechanic in terms of making for some hype, scary moments. For those of you that have played D&D, you're gonna know death saving throws, and while that still exists, it's a little different and you have a little more agency over your character in this moment. So for regular D&D, we know, hey, you hit 0, you drop unconscious, and you're now making death saving throws in hopes of, you know, stabilizing yourself. In this one, you get Death's Door, which is inherently a mode where you still get to exist and be played in the moments where your character is on just the edge of death and about to possibly take their final breath. Whenever you hit 0, your person bruised, battered, torn up, whatever, you can even, you know, role play it. They drop to 1 knee and they're barely hanging on by a thread. What this means in terms of actual game mechanics, you gain a point of exhaustion. You have an action point limit when your turn comes around, so because you are so bruised and battered, you get a limit of 1 action point on your turn instead of the normal 4, and then you cannot concentrate on anything. I think that's pretty fair, makes sense, and then you make your death saving throws. So that is kind of the general idea of Death's Door. Now these death saving throws, let's talk about them. So when making these death saving throws, it is just like usual. It is a DC of 10, so 10 or higher and you succeed. And that just means you get to continue and you're not taking any of this true damage. If you fail 1, so if you get less than a 10, you do take 1 true damage, putting you to -1, -2, -3, so on and so forth. And then when you critically fail, you continue to make these death saving throws, you take this damage, but you do fall unconscious at that point. So the only time you completely will lose agency of your character in a death situation is if you nat 1 a death saving throw after already being on death's door. So that is something that can happen. And as for being stabilized, if a creature comes over to you and they try to stabilize you, basically it just stops you from making these death saves, and that's going to be a DC 10 medicine check. So even if you have a +0, it's still 55 to 45 odds, which, hey, we always like that. We always take those. And again, it just stabilizes them. This one doesn't put them back to 1 HP, kind of like it would in something like D&D. You're still at your 0 point threshold, but you just don't have to make the death saves anymore, which is really, really good. Things like continuous damage do not continue to tick, otherwise you would just die way too easily if you're burning or bleeding or something like that, and you hit that 0 point threshold. The effect still stays on you, so if you come back up, but you don't take any damage while on death's door inherently. And then if it happens after combat, you basically continue, even if combat ends, you basically just continue the turn cycle, and every 12 seconds you're going to be rolling your death save to hopefully stay alive. So to get my quick death's door tangent and rant out of the way, just so you are aware, the way that this works is, like I said, when you hit 0, you go into that state, but then your like minimum threshold that you can hit before your character just dies is going to be your prime modifier. So the higher the level you are, the more damage you can take after 0 and not die, which is cool. But in the beginning, it only goes to -3. So you can kind of look at your health pool as like whatever your health is, plus an additional 3 kind of safety net to make sure you don't just insta-die. Now, one kind of bad thing that can happen here, in something like D&D, to use as the kind of easy example, you hit 0, you go unconscious. If someone hits you again, you take, your failed death saving throws. So you're not necessarily have a chance of like really getting insta-gibbed in that moment. Now you could fail your next death saving throw and, blah, yada, yada, yada. But in this system, because it's just health points that keep going down, someone could hit a super hard hit on you while you're on death's door and just insta-rip you, which is scary. Now again, this still somewhat exists in terms of D&D. It's not like this tabletop RPG exclusive, but it's just something to think about. And I've seen some people kind of homebrew their own rules where they're making it where, yeah, the -3 threshold exists, but like if an NPC hits you, you only go -1 on that threshold, and they use them as pseudo death save fails. Like that's kind of what it is, but it's a little different. So anyway, just something to think about, just a point to be made. It is a complaint that I've seen that I can understand where they come from for sure. Now to move on to what kind of is the main point of this video, and that's going to be the lack of damage dice and how damage works. Now, we've talked about this sort of in other videos, but damage is going to be very flat in the terms of your weapon itself might deal 1, maybe 2 damage, not counting additional maneuvers and things like that. And then for every 5 that you roll on your attack roll above their AC, it's going to add a damage. There's no damage dice to be had in this one, which, again, I really and truly believe is a much better way to go about it than damage dice. And there's a few reasons for that. So the first thing I want to talk about is honestly the problem with damage dice and kind of the issue that occurs. And that's going to be that the average damage that someone does, while yes, you can average it out and be like, okay, well, their likelihood to hit is this, and then their damage dice is this, so they should do on average this much damage, this many turns in a 10 round combat. So there you go, there's their average damage. Easy, I can balance monsters around that. But that's not how the real world works, okay? Whenever you do a 10 round combat, someone's only going to make, let's even say in an extreme example, 10 separate attacks. That's a really small sample size, so it's a very high likelihood that you get some crazy variables. All it takes is 2 critical hits, and your average damage that you tried to plan for as a DM is absolutely out the window, because they now rolled twice as much damage dice as they were supposed to on their turns. What do you do about that, right? And that is one of the, I think, biggest faults of using damage dice, is that it's near impossible to balance your enemies in a super well way, where you'll see a lot of combats that unfortunately end up turning up where it's either, they just absolutely slay, wipe the enemy, it don't matter, or on the other hand, they just can't hit the enemy for anything, or their damage dice are rolling low. And that's another problem, right, is looking at not necessarily the high end, but the low end. You could have someone not hitting any of their attacks, and it's unfortunate, feels bad. Now that happens in any system, right? The problem is, you could, as a character, roll a crit, you nat 20 your attack check, you're feeling great. Let's say you're a big barbarian fighter. Yes, I use this as an example a lot because it's easy. And you have your 1d12 great axe, and you got +4 to your strength mod. You're like, I'm about to freaking slay this thing. You crit hit, you're rolling 2d12 +4, and you get 2 1s, and your critical hit does 6 damage. Your range was anywhere from 6 to 28. That is insane. How do you balance a system in which your range is 6 to 28? Now, I know, again, like I just said, I understand, obviously, the logic is that you go with what their average roll should be. But again, that's just not how the real world works. Not everything's going to fall into its perfect average, especially if you look at individual combats where their sample size is a lot smaller. You know, over all of the combats, sure, their average damage is going to be about what it should be, but it's not going to be that for each one. So it just creates a lot of situations that are a lot of feel-bad moments. This system, because there's no damage dice, just makes you feel good. When you miss, you miss. It is what it is. That doesn't really change. That's not anything that is altered. However, when you hit, how hard or how well you strike that opponent actually directly affects the damage, because that's another thing that can happen is with regular damage dice and kind of the typical systems. If you roll a 19 on your die and it's like a super solid attack check and you beat their, AC by a ridiculous amount, who cares? You still get your 1d12 plus 4, it doesn't matter. Whereas in this system, rolling a 19 is huge. That can be the difference between 2 more damage steps, right? 2 more of those plus 5, so maybe you beat their AC by 10, in which case you're now dealing plus 2 damage, which is huge. For even your large weapons, that's going to double the amount of damage they do. So your 19 actually feels good, and your nat 20s are guaranteed to deal 2 additional damage on top of however much you're beating that AC by. So I think just overall the system is way more coherent and just makes a lot more sense. And there are tons of testimonies online, because I know a lot of people will kind of have the counter argument of like, yeah, but it feels so good to hit that 12 on a great axe roll. And it does, but logistically it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense for that to be the case, for you to like strike an enemy super hard, but then you only deal 2 damage, from your things, or you strike them really poorly, like you just barely hit the AC, but now you're dealing max damage all of a sudden. It's just weird, and it makes it more coherent. Anyway, to get back to my point, there's tons of testimonies online that are people that went into the system a little worried, a little weary, because they want their damage dice, but then after playing, they realize so quickly that they don't miss them at all, and that the system is not only A, more intuitive, but B, just feels better in every single one of those situations. And the last point I want to make on this is, for you DMs out there, this makes your life so much freaking easier, okay? Because all of your enemies can be balanced around this logic, right? Where it's like, okay, they have 8 health. Most of the people in my party are going to be doing 1, 2, or 3 damage, because that's about where his AC is at. Now, if they crit, they're going to be taking chunks off it that you may not have initially planned for, but it's not going to be as drastic as something like D&D can be, right? Because that, like I said, it's just when your damage range is like 6 to 28, it's really hard to mark for that. Whereas when your damage range is something like 2 to 6, that's a lot more easier to control and kind of balance around, knowing that that's about what you're going to be looking at. So anyway, that's all I have for terms of damage and health and how those things interact and how they work together. While the numbers, especially for your health, may look smaller, don't worry. It's because the damage numbers also balance that out and make it feel good. It's also one of those things where, it's just, I think, a much better, more intuitive, much simpler system. Now, if you disagree, let me know down in the comments below. If you think damage dice are a requirement and that they have a place in systems and that without them, the games are missing out, let me know down in the comments, and that's something that maybe I need to consider a little more of, and maybe I'm just a little too high on my DC20 horse, but hey. Nonetheless, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you're ready for some more DC20 content coming at you, and I will see y'all on the next one. Peace out.